Accessibility and Inclusiveness for February 23rd, 2022 to order. And first, I would like to recognize that we are on the unceded territory, it's the name of First Nations, on which we work, live, and play, and we thank them. So, first of all, the introduction of late items, and Sky.
Thank you. So staff don't have any late items today.
Okay. Thank you. So move for adoption of the agenda. Moved by Rachel, seconded by Eileen. All those in favor? Motion passes. And presentations. So, Lisa, are we here?
Sorry, Chair, just before we go into adoption of the agenda, if we could please have the adoption of the minutes.
Minutes, I totally overlooked them. Thank you. So if I could get a mover of the adoption of the minutes.
Jocelyn?
So Sarah and Adrian second. All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you, motion carries. Now for presentations, and Lisa Polsing, our Director of Community Development, is going to introduce our presenter. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Sam Turcott, who's with the BC Accessibility Directorate, and we were really thrilled to have time from him and his team helping support us as in terms of how we can meet the new BC Accessibility Act that was passed this year. And so without further ado, Sam, you can give yourself a bit more of an introduction and explain the role of your team, and then run us through a presentation. This is such a great topic for this particular committee, and we're just thrilled with the timing with Reimagine and your support. So over to you, Sam.
Wonderful. And will you be able to help share the presentation slides on screen when we get to that point? Or
I think
would it
we
be best?
can. Christy, are you able to do that for Sam?
Sure, I'll just get them prepped and I can pull them up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And as we're doing that, I just want to say good afternoon to the committee, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you about work underway on the implementation of the Accessible British Columbia Act. My name is Sam Turcott. I'm the Executive Lead for Accessibility at BC's Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. And I'm also the head of the Accessibility Directorate, which operates within that ministry. I'm pleased to join you this afternoon from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people. And I think we're just about at the point now where I might give it just a moment for slides to come up on screen. There we go. Our team works within the BC government to support initiatives that seek to identify, remove, and prevent barriers. You're on the right slide, and I'll just say next slide as we go. Our team works within the BC government to support initiatives that seek to identify, remove, and prevent barriers to the full and equal participation of people with disabilities in British Columbia. We support the work of the Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, Nicholas Simons, as well as BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Accessibility, Dan Coulter. And I'm happy to report that, as some of you may know, the Accessible BC Act was introduced in the BC legislature in the spring of 2021. And that as of June 17th, 2021, BC has its first formal statutory framework in place to support the identification, removal, and prevention of barriers to the full and equal participation of people with disabilities in BC. We'll move one slide forward. So this type of thing may be well known to members on an advisory committee, members of an advisory committee such as this, though I think that it's important to start from a place of shared understanding on the context for BC's accessibility legislation. Prior to passing the Accessible British Columbia Act, BC was in fact the largest jurisdiction by population in Canada that did not have, largest province rather, that didn't have some statutory framework in place for accessibility. There are 5 other provinces around the country that currently have accessibility legislation: Ontario, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, recently Newfoundland, and Quebec. And then additionally, as you may know, the federal government passed the Accessible Canada Act in the summer of 2019. And we are aware of a number of other provinces, including New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, which are currently in the process of developing accessibility legislation for their own provinces. And this is really just to emphasize that BC is one of a number of jurisdictions all around the country that are beginning to move forward with this type of accessibility legislation. We'll move one slide forward. This slide is really about talking about what is the most important content in BC's new accessibility legislation. We talk about this legislation as enabling legislation is the term that you'll hear for this type of scheme in government. And what that means is that the legislation sets out a broad objective, but then really to achieve the objective, the legislation requires significant ongoing work and implementation in order to introduce subsequently the regulations and policies in order to ultimately achieve the goal of the Act. Broadly speaking, when you look at the Accessible BC Act, we see this legislation as being a statutory framework for government to work in partnership with people with disabilities and the broader community to identify, remove, and prevent barriers to the full and equal participation of people with disabilities. And then if you were to go onto the BC Laws website and look at BC's accessibility legislation, all of the different pieces of the legislation in one way or another feed into that central objective. So just a number of the mechanisms that are introduced by the Accessible BC Act are outlined in this slide. So in particular, the Accessible BC Act provides the legal basis for the government of BC to develop and adopt accessibility standards in a range of different areas, as well as to bring those standards into law by regulation of the Lieutenant Governor and Council. The Accessible BC Act also provides for the establishment of a provincial accessibility committee consisting primarily of persons with disabilities or organizations supporting persons with disabilities that would be responsible for the development and recommendation of accessibility standards to government. Part 3 of the legislation directs government to undertake 3 new activities, in particular, to develop an accessibility plan, an accessibility committee, and that's the committee that I mentioned above, and a mechanism for feedback on the accessibility of government programs and services. Additionally, Part 3 of the legislation allows the Lieutenant Governor and Council to prescribe other organizations that would also have that same bundle of 3 responsibilities, namely have an accessibility plan for the organization, a committee for the organization, and a feedback mechanism in place. And then the last piece that I'll flag, although this is by no means the only parts of the legislation provides a framework for compliance and enforcement in the event that as the legislation is implemented in future, there are instances of non-compliance to address. BC has very much hitched its wagon to the federal approach on this, and providing for, the legislation provides for a statutory penalty of up to $250,000 for non-compliance. It's important to note what we've seen in other jurisdictions, and very much the model that we anticipate following here in BC, is that you have a statutory maximum in the legislation, and as the legislation is implemented, regulations will outline more specific ranges depending on the nature of a contravention. So that just the idea is there that future regulations will outline in greater detail how those penalties will work as the legislation is implemented. We want to go one slide forward. So as I've noted, the Accessible BC Act became law last June. So we're just midway through the first year of implementation now. And this slide takes us from what is the content of the legislation to what is that work that's underway now to implement BC's accessibility legislation. And there are a number of streams of work that we have in place currently. I'm happy to report to this committee that Minister Simons announced the appointment of members to the inaugural Provincial Accessibility Committee on December 3rd in conjunction with the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. We're very pleased to have a strong and diverse representation across the disability community, strong representation in terms of regional backgrounds, cultural identity, Indigenous identity, and so on. That group held its first meeting in January of 2022 and will be holding its second meeting in March of 2022 to begin its work in supporting government's implementation of the legislation. Additionally, our team is currently working across government on the development of a multi-year accessibility plan for the BC government, as well as the development of that feedback mechanism that would allow members of the public to more easily communicate accessibility barriers encountered in accessing government services. We've begun conversations with the new Provincial Accessibility Committee about how work on the development of those provincial accessibility standards will proceed. I anticipate that the initial work to begin accessibility standards development will start later on this year. The main priorities that we're working on the preliminary side is just to work with the Provincial Accessibility Committee on how accessibility standards will be prioritized and sequenced. What we've tended to see in other jurisdictions is that the work that goes into developing an accessibility standard, even in a given area, say employment, for example, is quite detailed and requires robust consultation with the disability community and with the broader community, and that even a given standard can take up to a couple of years from the point of beginning the work on through policy development to public consultation. So we want to be able to start that work quickly, anticipating that it will be that there will be a road to follow in order to be able to bring those standards into effect for British Columbia. Finally, our team has begun work engaging with a number of public sector organizations around the province, including municipalities, on some work to identify other organizations under Part 3 of the Accessible BC Act that would be responsible to bring into that umbrella. In our engagement with organizations, including municipalities, what we have said is that we're proposing to move forward with an initial regulation under the Accessible BC Act, identifying a cross-section of different public sector organizations in September of 2022, and that regulation would provide any organizations identified with at minimum 1 year to conduct that work within their own organizations, recognizing that it's important that we give a generous runway for organizations around the province to begin thinking about how to continue to embed accessibility within the culture of their organization. We'll go one slide forward. Oh, and I was a little bit ahead of myself in my speaking notes. I apologize. This slide really is just reiterating what I've just shared regarding the work that's underway to extend Part 3 of the Accessible BC Act beyond core government out to other organizations across the public sector. I believe there's just one slide left in our presentation this afternoon. And this is really to talk in a little bit more detail about those Part 3 pieces of the Act. Because I think it's quite important as we have these conversations to clarify the Accessible BC Act asks government and any organizations prescribed by regulation to have that accessibility plan, to have an accessibility committee, to have a feedback mechanism. But that part of the Act is, in fact, quite broad and flexible to the circumstances of different types of organizations. And it really places discretion within the organization about how that work is conducted. And one of the reasons that that discretion is embedded in the legislation is that when we were designing the legislation through 2019 and 2020, we knew that we wanted Part 3 of the legislation to make sense for lots of different types of organizations, regardless of their specific capacity or mandate. And we have continued to feel that it's important that in asking organizations to really work across the province in supporting the identification, removal, and prevention of barriers, that there needed to be a significant amount of flexibility afforded to organizations in looking at how to do that best for the type of organization that would be conducting the work. So in particular, looking at that requirement to develop an accessibility plan, the legislation doesn't specify requirements with respect to length or content, and that will be left at the discretion of organizations. Additionally, for accessibility committees, there will be flexibility if organizations have an accessibility committee in place already to appoint an existing committee or to appoint, for example, a staff committee within the organization that the organization wishes to provide advice on accessibility matters. Similarly, organizations that have already begun to conduct work in addressing barriers for people with disabilities are encouraged to use those resources to meet the requirements of Part 3 of the legislation in terms of accessibility planning or the establishment of an accessibility feedback mechanism. With that, I will just offer one more time my very sincere gratitude for the opportunity to come and speak to this committee. I will be happy to stick around and answer any questions that committee members may have about work underway to implement the Accessible BC Act. And I look forward to any discussion that this generates.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. And I'm sure we probably will have generated a few questions here. I'm just looking for some hands to come up. Oh, I've got Lisa.
I'll let Jocelyn go ahead.
There we go. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Jocelyn, yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm really interested to hear how this act is going to be brought to life. I'm wondering if you could give us an example, Sam, of what the public sector organizations you were speaking to in Section 3, and I couldn't quite figure out exactly how that fit into the overall work you're doing and how it sort of relates to what we do. So could you give us an example?
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing that I will say, Part 3 of the legislation provides quite a broad grant of discretion really to bring any organization, whether in the private or public sector, under the umbrella of that Part 3 piece. As a matter of policy discretion, we have been focusing on developing recommendations initially to bring public sector organizations within the scheme of the legislation. And we'll look at a later stage about whether or not other organizations in the private sector would be appropriate to also bring into the scheme. When we talk about public sector organizations, and it'll be a couple months yet before anything rolls forward with the regulation, but we're thinking about anything from local governments to post-secondary institutions, to school districts, to certain crown corporations, really the organizations around within the public sector that deliver those kind of day-to-day frontline services to people in communities. Is that a helpful response? And please direct me if I didn't respond, to the question you were asking.
And when you say brought into the umbrella of the Act, does that mean that they would be, subject to the Act itself and any any laws applying to accessibility, for example, like counter height in a front-facing?
I understand. So the legislation has a number of different parts, and Part 3 is the piece that I'm speaking about here, and that's the accessibility planning requirements and committee requirements. Part 4 of the legislation is the part that provides for the development and adoption of accessibility standards. Just because an organization is included under Part 3, that doesn't automatically mean that an accessibility standard developed under Part 4 in the future will automatically apply to it. Those standards, as they are developed, will need to outline who the standards apply to. And that'll vary depending on the nature of a standard. So right now, the piece that I'm talking about for Part 3 is just limited towards the accessibility planning and committee pieces.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I see Lynn's hand up.
Thank you. Sam, hi there. I was just curious, you might have said this and I might have missed it, but I remember there was a series of consultations that happened across the province. And is this legislation the result of all of those consultations that happened?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And I'll let you know, Lynn, I actually used to have a slide in this presentation that talked about those public consultations. And I find fewer and fewer people remember them because they were a couple of years ago now. But the work to develop this legislation didn't just begin in 2021. This is actually work that has been in stream for a number of years. So in the fall of 2019, then Minister Shane Simpson initiated a province-wide public consultation on the development of this legislation. And that is ultimately what led to the legislation then being tabled last year.
Okay, thank you. I really wanted to know that because I participated in one of those.
Oh, wonderful.
And it was a really large group of people with all sorts of various diverse abilities is the word I like to use. And so it's really, I think, important for people to understand that that series of events happened across the province, and that there were, the relevant stakeholders were included in the process.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And one thing that I really want to impress to any group that I go and speak with about this legislation, we have the enabling framework in place, and I think that we did a good job of bringing a really broad cross-section of views across the disability community to inform the development of this legislation. But we also know that it's going to be really, really important the government continues to robustly engage across the disability community as we continue to implement this act.
Thank you. Rachel.
Hi. I was just wondering why the government didn't specify how the committees, the new accessibility committees will be set up. Like, for example, like, you know, having a rule that like there can't be 100% able-bodied people on a committee. That's for, you know, disability accessibility.
Yeah, I think it's fair. And it's, you know, an area where government is trying to lead by example. I'm happy to say that the accessibility committee that Minister Simons appointed in December is extremely diverse in terms of the lived experience of people with disabilities that are brought to the table. When we look at the different organizations, and, you know, we're not just talking about local government necessarily, but, you know, we're looking at everything from large organizations to small organizations. And, you know, I'm a person with a disability myself. And I believe firmly that it is critical that the implementation of this legislation be embedded in the lived experience of people with disabilities. We also know that different types of organizations are in all different types of places in terms of their capacity to support internal and external committees. And the legislation doesn't use a stick in terms of, you know, punishing organizations if they are, you know, as they establish those accessibility committees. I think in practice, what we're going to see is that government is going to be encouraging organizations to ensure robust lived experience of people with disabilities on those committees. And I think that we're going to see organizations looking to achieve that goal where possible. And also, you know, the counterpoint to that is recognizing the need to provide organizations with some flexibility to do that work in a way that's consistent with the capacity of individual organizations.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who has any further comments or questions? I don't see anybody raising their hands, but Lisa just appeared. So Lisa, did you wish to add?
I just wanted to wrap up and thank Sam, because what the next presentation you're going to see, Sam and his team kindly took a look at a first cut at some draft wording that's coming out to the community and helped clarify for us how some of the work we've been doing through your committee, this committee here, is helping us inform and meet those requirements. So we're just very grateful for him and his team's time ahead of time, coming here today, and maybe sticking around as we go through the next presentation. So I just, through the chair, just wanted to note that and thank Sam as we move on to the next. Thank you.
Thank you. It feels like everything's aligning very, very well. So we'll move on to the next item on the agenda is item number 6, reports, and the Transit Stop Accessibility Working Group, the verbal update. And Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, good afternoon, committee. I'm just going to pass this item right over to Jamie Rose, our transportation manager. You've all received an email from Lainey Stevenson, I'm sure, and Mr. Rose will report out on that. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, this is going to be definitely short and sweet as well, but as noted, you all received an email a week or a couple of weeks ago inviting you to participate. We've now been able to cast a number of representatives from the committee, as well as various members from our partnership agencies with the RDN and BC Transit. And we've got a internal meeting tomorrow to confirm the project schedule. And then after that, we'll be circulating that to all the members and starting off our process to have a look at what other communities are doing, and then talk about some of the important things that we need to address or modify, and then we'll be having a couple of touch points to come back to this committee and provide updates along the way. And then we'll be wrapping up just before the summer break. So getting ready to roll.
Thank you. That's good timing. Did anybody have any further questions? I think it's a very important working group, and I'm hoping that they'll provide great feedback for how we can make those transit stops even more accessible. So thank you. Item number 6B, 2022 Advisory Committee, to be introduced, our work plan by Lynn Wark. Lynn.
Thank you. Just prior to introducing our revised 22 work plan, I would like to let the committee know that unfortunately Linda Dirksen has had to resign from the committee. And so I just want to thank her very much for all of her participation and work that she's done on behalf of the committee. And I'm sure the rest of you probably would agree that she is owed a big thank you. And so I just wanted to put that out there and let you know that the process, from what I understand, is that I should be writing an in-camera report to council to ask them how they would like us to proceed in terms of whether we get somebody else onto the committee or not. This is the final term of the committee, so we just have we'll have 3 meetings left this year. So I'll be working on that, just so that you know, and I'm telling you this because it's not included in the work plan.
And I thank you, and on behalf of the committee, yes, Linda was a very valuable member, and we'll miss her for the last few meetings, and thank you for looking after that, Lynn, and we'll see what council has for feedback.
Okay, now in terms of our 22 Accessibility and Inclusiveness Committee work plan, you should have it as part of your agenda package. Our recommendation is that the ACAI committee approve forwarding the 2022 work plan to council for review and approval. And what you should notice is it looks almost identical to the draft version that you looked at our last meeting, but we did take your feedback and add onto the plan accessible parking as a topic that we want to address. We need to look at the outstanding gender diversity and inclusion recommendations, which I know a couple of senior leadership team members are meeting on to discuss that further next week. The way I had left it with you last time is I reported back that there's a desire for some gender diversity and inclusion training prior to the report going forward to council, just so that they can make a more well-informed decision once the report comes forward. We added on accessible programs and services at Parks, Recreation and Culture. So the committee has asked for a staff presentation on what currently is on offer. The committee also asked for a presentation from city staff to get updated on all of the work that's going on around accessible housing, and another presentation and discussion on accessibility and snow events, which we would continue based on the conversation we had at our last meeting. And I do know that we have a presentation lined up for our next meeting in April for that. So those were all of the additional topics that we included on the work plan. And I'm happy to take any questions or see if anyone wants to make a recommendation to bring it forward to council.
Thank you, Lynn, and I'll just say that's some work plan for the next 2 or 3 meetings. So first of all, does anybody have any questions or want to move a motion? Okay, Sandra.
I like the work plan. I know that it is a lot of work to be completed, but I move the motion to send it forward to the City Council. Yeah.
Thank you. Moved by Sandra. Do I have a seconder? Seconded by Rachel. Any further questions, comments, discussion? It's a great work plan, and if we can cover all this, I'll be very impressed, and we will have given valuable feedback to council. We love this committee for all the work that's being done. Lynn.
I just thought it might be worthwhile pointing out, looking at the new Accessible BC Act and the legislation, I think that's going to be helpful in accomplishing the first goal of the work plan, which was the guiding principles piece. Mm-hmm. So I just think we need to make sure we pay attention to looking at that Accessible BC Act to help us with that work.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll count on you. Okay, without any further comments or questions, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Anybody opposed? Nobody's opposing? Okay, motion carries. It's okay if this meeting goes quickly, you guys, because we actually have another one coming up. So we're going to be using this committee a lot, especially with the Reimagine and everything. So, item 6C is the draft city plan accessibility and inclusiveness policies. And back to you, Lisa.
Okay. Through the chair, we are, again, really humbled and pleased to, we hope, reflect back to you some of the input we've learned from you over the past year or so, as well as through Sam Turcotte. So what Christy Mcdonald is going to provide to you is a draft, very much a draft. First time coming to you with some wording and language in our overarching city plan document done through the Reimagine process. It is going to go to council. It's on council's agenda for the 28th of March. 28th of February, I'm ahead of myself, next Monday. And if you have time to tune in to see the overall, today Christy's going to focus on accessibility and inclusiveness elements of the plan. And you don't have to absorb it and provide feedback on everything right now, because one of the things we hope at the end of Christy's presentation and a bit of conversation is to have a workshop with you specifically in March. And we have a proposed date where we can get into a bit more depth after you have time to absorb some of the draft language that we're putting before you tonight. And so with this, I'd like to turn over to Christy Mcdonald to present that to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Hoping everyone can see the slide deck. Great. As Lisa said, this is very much an ongoing process, and I'm just noticing that even the title that we're showing you right now on the screen, Reimagine Nanaimo Update, the new plan has been branded today, City Plan Nanaimo Reimagined. So over the next few weeks, we'll be taking a lot of additional input, definitely through this committee and through the general public. And you'll see that all reflected back later in the spring with a final document. So for today, I'd like to just draw your attention to the information report that I know you've received, and some of the draft policies that you have also received for review. There'll be a new, much prettier version of a lot of those policies available very shortly on our city's website, and we'll be getting that to you as soon as we can. But the information report is a key part of our presentation today. We're also going to be talking about some linkages back to the presentation that Sam gave regarding the BC Accessibility Act, and then walking you through some of our timelines for phase 3 and how we'd like to reach out to you for additional work over the course of the spring. So first of all, I'm sure you've all had a chance to look at it, but we did provide to you one chapter of what we're calling City Plan Nanaimo Reimagined. And the chapter that we pulled out for you was called Empowered Nanaimo. And that's where these 10 items that you have seen are reflected in this chapter, Empowered Nanaimo. And actually, I believe you only received the sections about equity and inclusivity, political voice and engagement, and access for all. But there are additional sections for you to be aware of that are all couched together in the full document of City Plan Nanaimo Reimagined. And they include an array of topics from truth and reconciliation, and also a lot regarding parks, recreation, and culture, and making that resource fully accessible in Nanaimo. So there will be more information coming to you over the coming months. What you have received is part of what we're going to be putting in a bylaw document, which means that it will go to a public hearing later in the spring, and it will be a document that has a lot of clout in Nanaimo because it is a bylaw as opposed to just a guiding document. We just wanted to highlight for you a few of the topic areas that are in those policies. And first of all, in the draft right now for consideration is a desired outcome regarding equity and inclusivity that includes making sure that Nanaimo provides opportunities for active involvement and prosperity for all, welcomes the contributions of all members, facilitates participation and social interaction across all cultures, orientations, ages, and abilities, and recognizes and fosters respect for diversity. And a lot of this language came out of the workshop that we did together back in December. Several of you were part of a workshop where we talked about definitions and different elements that we wanted in our desired outcomes and goals for this project. Also having environments and spaces across all areas of the city that are diverse and vibrant for the enjoyment of all residents. Celebrating diverse cultures and a community that is welcoming, inclusive, and accepting of all. Equitable access to services, programs, and facilities for all residents. And demonstrating city leadership by receiving training, sharing resources, knowledge, and applying an equity and diversity lens to all city initiatives and decision-making processes. Under another chapter, political voice and engagement, or another topic area, there's an array of desired outcomes helping to make civic engagement something that is accessible to all people in Nanaimo. So an informed and aware community who can meaningfully participate in city processes and shape decisions. Opportunities for all people to express their voice on community matters. Demonstrated city leadership and active listening, space for representation that reflects the diverse population of Nanaimo, so that decision-making, planning, policy development, and the creation of procedures consider a broad range of perspectives that represent the community diversity, and respectful conversations that encourage effective participation and ensure that all members of the community are seen and heard. And lastly, under access for all, a desired outcome of options for people of all ages and abilities to freely move throughout the city without barriers, and allowing people of all ages and abilities and income levels to have easy access to services and spaces without barriers. And this section, we've had so many policies that we've actually broken it up into several areas, including policies for administrative, which is really some of the work that's been ongoing for a couple of years at the city, the Legislative Services Office, where by this committee, in fact, was established to help improve equity and diversity throughout the community. Also, another area is parks and recreation facilities, and that ties in a lot to what is in your work plan that Lynn has brought up. Recreation programs, land use and development, like the affordable and accessible housing, and mobility and transportation, like the ongoing work that you are doing with Jamie Rose and Bill Sims. So right now, you're just getting a portion of what is this full document, and we will be sharing the entire document with you after council receives it. And council is receiving it in an agenda package, I believe, tomorrow, if not today. And they are also being introduced to it officially on Monday of next week. And then also coming very shortly in the future is an accessory document to the city plan Nanaimo Reimagined. And it is an integrated action plan. And this ties into a lot of the project-based work that will be reflected throughout the community. And it includes immediate projects, immediate programs, as well as future and ongoing work and programs. So as a next step, we're really, obviously we're presenting to you today. We are launching next week publicly for phase 3, and it's a 6-week engagement period where we're asking all individuals to get involved in giving us their feedback through a variety of ways and methods, including some online survey information. We are also running a statistically valid survey that you may be lucky enough to receive in the mail as a citizen of Nanaimo, and also several community workshops. So we are looking to connect with you as individuals through that process, and we'll be asking you to share the information amongst your networks as well as it goes forward next week. But as Lisa mentioned, we're also looking to have a committee meeting with you in the month of March to dive into some of the topics in an in-depth way. Some of the, we really want your feedback specifically on the policies and directions, and we will talk more about a potential date for that in March. Now, Sam was generous to come today and give us his time and share about the BC Accessible Act update. And I'm not going to dwell on a lot of the detail of the slides because you've heard his presentation, but we did share with him maybe a draft a month ago of these policies that you've received in your information report. And part of what we're really hoping to accomplish is through these sections of Reimagine Nanaimo and the city plan, we want to accomplish the Accessible BC Act requirements and really make this document be that vision for accessibility and inclusivity in our community and our framework for how we move forward. So we're hoping that these sections of this document can be that plan for us moving forward. We do need to have a commitment statement in the document to make it meet the Act requirements. We also have to have a committee, which we already do because you're already on it, and a feedback mechanism. And the plan has to be updated every 3 years. And that really will be that action plan that I was mentioning that we are getting ready to share with you as well, which is a document that will get updated very regularly on all topic areas. And it will keep our projects and programs and approach current with the community needs. So as we already have discussed, we've met with the Accessibility Directorate, and Sam has confirmed that the direction we seem to be taking does fulfill the legislation requirements. And that's wonderful because we're already a step ahead, as well as we were already a step ahead by having this committee established. So lastly, just as we're moving into phase 3 of the the city plan Nanaimo Reimagined process, personally, I find this to be the most exciting phase of the plan. We're really seeing everything to come together. All the ideas that we've heard through phase 1 and 2, which encompasses about 2 years worth of work, are now coming to fruition. And we're looking at closing the public engagement for this in early April, and then moving forward through some of the more formal government to government referrals and bylaw processes later in May and June, with the potential for council to review the final document and adopt it in July. Throughout the last 2 years worth of work in phase 1 and phase 2, we've really done a very robust process of reaching the community. So we've had several thousand people throughout Nanaimo engaged in some form of feedback throughout our planning process. And we want to show the community throughout phase 3 how the plan is now reflecting back all the great ideas that we've heard, and also just get confirmation that this is still the direction the community wants to go for a 25-year vision. It's been challenging, and we've had to be creative throughout the process because, of course, we've been doing all the engagement through COVID. COVID hit 2 years ago, and I think in some ways it's actually made the engagement more accessible to people by us being out in the community and trying out some new methods, some that have been really effective in engaging people in ways that maybe they wouldn't have wanted to reach out before, such as Zoom stakeholder meetings and some of the other online options. So starting next week, we will be launching phase 3. We're meeting with City Council on February 28th, and it'll be following that we will officially do the launch. And just wanted to highlight for you that at the moment there are 12 big themes that have come through the previous 2 years worth of work and engagement. And one of the key themes was inclusivity and equitability. And so that has been a desire and a direction that has really resonated with the entire community of Nanaimo. And so we're targeting a lot of our engagement to showing that big move and showing how our community is working towards being inclusive and equitable, as well as the other topics that you see here. And we can share more information about each of these topics with you next week. And we'll be using a variety of methods throughout the next 6 weeks to discuss the draft plan with the community, including having it available, the full document available online for review. It is about a 300-page document, so it can be quite overwhelming, but it does have a lot of hyperlinks and different word search tools integrated into it to help make it as user-friendly as possible. We also are going to have a story map, which is a fairly new method of visually integrating information across a geography, the geography of our city, and that will be available online next week. We will also have online community surveys and print surveys available for people that do not have access to digital information. I mentioned that there'll be a mail-out survey, and that is reaching a statistically valid sample throughout the community to help confirm directions. I mentioned the 12 themes, one of which is inclusivity and equity. And we will be running some public workshops that people can sign up for in advance. The dates will be released next week, but they are all in the month of March at the moment. And then we'll be doing some videography work, which will be coming out on YouTube and other social media channels in the month of March. And we'll be doing referrals to all of our government agencies and other organizations that we work with. When you do see the document, not the information report attachment, but when you see the full document next week, you will notice that it's a highly visual document, and we've tried to make the materials as accessible as possible for people. They are covering some really complex land use and technical issues, so it is hard to make all of that information really accessible. Most of our land use bylaws don't include this level of graphic work, so we've tried to really incorporate a high visual component as well as easily viewable maps. Oh, my apologies. Oh, I will just reconnect. But you will notice a high level of graphic content as you're looking through the document. And as I mentioned, the online version, at least, is highly linked with graphic icons as well. And we're interested to hear more from the committee, possibly in this workshop in March, for future engagement as well. What other methods of accessible engagement and accessible materials might be explored. If you do know of somebody who needs a specialized method, we can tailor it to them, whether it be just one-on-one or another way to communicate the visuals as well and the text. So as I mentioned, phase 3 engagement is starting next week. This date is incorrect. This slide was prepared a couple of weeks ago, and engagement is actually launching March 1st and closing at the moment April 8th. And we're really hoping that you can participate throughout the phase 3 engagement as individuals and hopefully as a committee. And I do see that there's been a tentative date scheduled for, it's in the agenda, potentially March 23rd during your regular meeting time as a potential for a special meeting with this committee. Not sure if that resonates with you or not, but we would like to have some direction today on when the committee might be available to really do a deeper dive into all these really important policies. And hopefully by then we may also have the action plans available for you to review. And that is the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Kirsty. Thank you for all that information. So if we can stop sharing the screen, then I can see if anybody has any questions or comments further. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Oh, I wasn't raising my hand, but I will say that I am impressed with the work. And I'm really actually nerdly excited to read the document. So I'm looking forward for its release and also the action plan. Good work. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Sarah.
Oh, Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Zenny. And thank you, Kirsty. That was an awesome presentation. It's good to see, you know, that work being done. I had a good look at the Accessible British Columbia Act, and I realized that in you got that guiding you, and that there's not a lot of content specifically within that. It's more addressed in other areas where talking about making things accessible for people who are non-binary or the gender diverse community. And specifically, I mean, an example of that would be accessible public washrooms that are gender neutral, but also in language that that our city would use in communications with people of the city, that language would be inclusive as well. And so I'm hoping that that's been taken into consideration. And I know that our council is looking into a workshop that would get them better informed around matters around gender and being inclusive in that way. But, you know, for example, one of your earlier slides, you talked about desired outcomes and you talked about different populations of people. Genders would have been a great thing to see there, you know, without barriers for all genders. But that wasn't there, but that would be wonderful to see there. I think this is our great opportunity to address that in our city. So yeah, the other point I wanted to ask, actually a question, and it would be that I'm curious if there are any engagement strategies to reach out to people who are homeless in Nanaimo, not just referring to people who are street involved or homeless on the street, but homelessness can look like couch surfing or youth who have unsafe homes, and so on. So I don't know if there's anything in the works there. I'm very curious.
I think you bring up some very valid points, and accessibility is not just diverse mobility. There are other barriers as well for inclusiveness. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up. Before we go to Rachel, I think I'll look for Lisa to talk about what we do in our community, and we do have reaching out to homelessness, etc. So Lisa.
Thank you. Some of you may or may not have been involved in the Health and Housing Task Force work that actually did inform some of the policies and approaches in this plan. That did include direct outreach with those who have lived experience with homelessness. And what we'll be doing for this round is relying on the groups that have those direct outreach and contacts to support us in those conversations. So the Health and Housing Task Force, all of those reports that were done about a year ago are all online, including the outcomes of conversations. We did what was called design labs, basically workshops for people with lived experience. And then we also had both Nanaimo First Nation and other groups directly engage with people where people may not have felt comfortable with city staff, for example, facilitating and doing it through their own processes. So we'll be asking those groups again if they could kindly help us that way, knowing that this is a pretty chunky document compared to the conversations we had before, and hoping that all the visuals that we have online can help those who work with people who are struggling with homelessness, can help with that translation and communication piece. So it's certainly not, it's probably not a perfect process, but we do hope that with what's allowed during COVID, because what we did find is that direct contact and conversation seem to work better than Zoom, particularly where things like access to internet might have been a barrier for some people. So Sarah, I think that that's a challenge we'll have to navigate as things open up, I think, a little bit more for us, and perhaps provide a little bit more opportunity in this phase. I have to say, Christy, who has been the, a huge help in terms of the outreach to a huge number of people across our city in terms of leading community engagement by posters and parks and a range of different methods. We had really hoped a year ago that we would not still be in this space. And yet at the same time, we've had a lot of feedback from people saying that we've made meetings more accessible by being in this virtual world. So it's interesting. I think going forward, we're just going to continue using both methods, even when things fully open up. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Lisa. Rachel.
Hi, I was really excited to see these policies. They look great. I had some notes written up similar to what Sarah was saying. I was wondering if it'd be possible for the city to consider enshrining in their policies that they do a working group with gender non-conforming folks, and also Indigenous people and Black people and people, Nanaimo residents who are in the prison. Because when you're like in prison, you're going to come out and you're coming back into your community, but you have no engagement while you're stuck in there. So I was wondering if it was possible because, and the street community, because I feel like there's less barriers for people who are invisibly homeless to participate in society than there are for people who are on the street. So I was wondering if the city would consider specifically putting in their policies that they're going to create working groups for those people to participate, because they may not be able to without the city actually specifically working on it.
Thank you, Rachel. Good question. I'll let Lisa answer that one too.
Actually, Rachel, you raise a really good point. So I'm looking, because sometimes the screens jump, so I feel like I'm stretching my head as the screen moves around. So with regard to those who end up incarcerated, perhaps at Brannan Lake, for example, I think specifically, one thing we can do, and I actually do have a direct contact with an Indigenous liaison there, is ask them to promote and actually have engagement through that a trusted channel that way. We, of course, do work with Nanaimo First Nation, and we'll continue to work with them through this process. And then through this process, we are relying on a lot of the groups who we've engaged with earlier to be our bridge. And then in terms of those who are BIPOC and of different backgrounds, I was actually just looking through the document because I know that we had actually put in there about all inclusive. We might not have used the word gender, but there was policies in there around washroom access for all in all facilities. So that's in our plan. Christy couldn't focus on everything, so we did focus on certain elements of accessibility, less so on that piece. But at the same time, you may read through it and say, you know what, we're suggesting tweaks to this language and so forth. But Christy, I think there's some pieces in there, and I was just doing a quick search through on specifically on washrooms. And then there was another piece that was asked, Rachel, and I think that was around policies and the wording we've used. and it's partly because language has shifted so much, and in 25 years may shift again. And so we're using language that is as inclusive as possible, knowing that terminology may change around, and I think it's in the sections around empowerment and political voice that allow for people of all orientations and abilities and cultures to participate and process it. So it's in there, it just may not. Part of the challenge has been evolving language, and I don't doubt in 10 years' time, people might say, sorry, BIPOC is no longer the term, we're now going to use this, just as we've gone from Aboriginal to Indigenous and those transitions. So that's been kind of a little bit of our challenge. Sam Turcotte has actually helped us with making sure that we use terms, and I think even this committee, universal access, versus there were other terms that are floated around. And so that has been one of our challenges, but we are absolutely open to more suggestions, trying to think ahead in 25 years' time. Can we be inclusive enough of the language that something else comes up or shifts, that we're still capturing that piece? So not an exact science by any means, but certainly attempting to really hear what we're hearing from peers through the Health and Housing Task Force, through this process here. And
just a reminder, Lisa, also too, that what they've looked at the moment is the bylaw component, which is the policies and bylaws.
Correct.
Some of those actions are really going to be reflected in the programs and projects. So specific, something very specific like washrooms, you're going to see that more in the action plan, and then you will be in the policy. It's more motherhood statements of having accessibility to all. But when it comes into the specifics of which washrooms and how it's all washrooms, but there's staging, you're going to see that in the action plans.
Thank you. Good reminder, Christy.
Thank you, ladies. Adrian.
Oh, I was muted there. I tried really hard to unmute. Thank you so much for this plan and all of the work that's gone into it, and for coming back to this committee all the way through. I apologize because I had to step away for a phone call, so this may have already been said, but just returning to the language, I think I know actually, when in talking to my children that, they can pick out right away when something is worded in a way where a group will or will not feel included. And I learn so much from them each day, and I'm conscious that as an adult, out in the world, I'm playing catch up to what they know to be true. And I feel like if someone feels like they can't see themselves in the plan, then that's a real loss. And I know that language does shift, and at the same time, I know that there are ways to be more inclusive all the time. And I'm grateful to Sarah for bringing it up. And I just wanted to put my voice behind that as well.
Thank you. And Lisa.
One of the things that I hope, and Christy, this is around our glossary of terms that I think would be really helpful to have this committee's review on, is that, and I know Sam had and his team had taken a crack at reviewing a few of ours, but I think that's a piece that is important because sometimes a term can be interpreted very differently. So what do we mean in this plan by that term? What does this committee want to see that term, whatever the term is around accessibility and inclusivity, mean? So we do have a glossary document that's going to be also put out online. And I think, Christy, with the workshop, I think that might be a really important one to circulate because I think that's where, even terms like BIPOC, it can mean different things in terms of how people frame that. So what does our community want to see that portrayed as? And the same with terms like gender inclusive and things like that. So
I believe at the moment we're using LGBTQ plus, I think is what it says.
Yeah, and there are other ones out there as well. So again, how, what's the preference and how do we do that with guidance from this committee? And that's where I think we're quite relieved to have you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Sam, you popped on. Did you wish to add to that?
Well, I was going to offer to jump in with the permission of the chair.
Yes.
And, you know, let me just offer, firstly, that, you know, from our perspective here in the Accessibility Directorate, Nanaimo is way ahead in terms of the work that's underway to begin to align its activities with the Accessible BC Act. I've been listening with great interest to the discussion about how to embed the lived experience of, you know, diverse communities, you know, beyond just looking at disability. And if it's helpful, one thing that we did in the Accessible BC Act early on is include a provision about intersectionality. And just to clarify in the Accessible BC Act itself, you know, that there was an understanding that people's lived experience of disability is shaped by, you know, the diverse kind of backgrounds that different people with disabilities bring to their daily life. And ultimately, I don't want to presume what the right approach is for the city of Nanaimo in terms of calibrating that, but I would certainly encourage taking a look at the statement around intersectionality in the Accessible BC Act as one way to think about how you could begin to just signal that, you know, those diverse and intersectional experiences are acknowledged in the types of barriers that that folks experience.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And is there anybody else? Oh, I see Rachel.
No, that's a thumbs up.
Oh, that's a thumbs up. Oh, right. Thank you very much. Is there anybody else who has anything further? Well, I'll say good evening to everybody, and thank you again, Mr. Turcotte. Thank you to all of Nanaimo City staff for being here and supporting us. Mr. Harding, you appeared. Did you wish to say anything?
Just I always like to at least say goodbye when I get on.
Okay.
I don't say much, but yeah.
Everybody have a good evening, but we will see you all in March, so we will make
Thanks,
up.
everyone.
Oh, Lynn, you've got your hand up.
I was waving goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a good evening.
See ya.
Oh,
Thanks,
I
everyone.
guess I should say a move for adjournment.
And sorry, Chair, just before that, I just need to announce that we do have question period, even though we're in a virtual meeting.
Oh, right.
But there's
Yes.
no one in the boardroom to ask questions.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you. Do I have a mover for adjournment?
Jocelyn
So
moves.
Jocelyn, and seconded by Sandra. All those in, thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
You too.